sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. This week, we are joined by somebody who has more than athletic accolades. Usually, I read the achievements of them on the court, but this time we're going to read on the court and off the court. Len Elmore from the University of Maryland, three-time All-ACC player, 1974 All-American, one of the 50 greatest players of the ACC, 10-year NBA veteran. After his career, became a Harvard-trained attorney, longtime college basketball analyst, now a professor of sports management and athlete activism at Columbia University. We are so thrilled to have Len Elmore join the show. Len, thanks for being with us.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
So as I told you just before, you were a voice of my childhood, specifically with Syracuse basketball, and going through the clips yesterday, hearing your voice as we made that run through the tourney. As you can see behind me, still have remnants of that 2003 run of Melo and Coach Boeheim. So let's start there, because I get to talk to somebody who guided me through that journey. When you don't see the people that you're talking to, like me, what are you trying to get across to the people who are on that journey, both physically there, but really in their hearts and souls as well?
Well, I mean, if you're speaking about my role as a color analyst, I think my first purpose is really to educate through my experience as a player and through my experience in development in basketball. And on television particularly, the idea is to explain what you just saw, not only what, but why and how, and sometimes really project what's next. And again, based on the experience that I've had, based on what I've seen. And all of it, when you put it all together, it should be, an enjoyable addition to what you already see and feel with regard to the sport itself. Try not to get in the way, but just to be kind of an additional support in how to really understand and enjoy the game.
So not necessarily like the referees when you don't want to hear their names, correct? You want actually the volume to be up to hear, because I love what you said, to explain what is happening from an expert. And you are an expert based on your time on the court, but not every player makes the best analyst. So how do you translate that part of your career from on the court, both in college and the NBA, to behind the microphone, explaining to both the novice and the expert something that we may not see?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with communicative skills and to be trained in that. As an English major, and I took speech, diction, but also recognizing how to reach people and communicate on a level that people can certainly understand. And that's what I strive for. I may not always succeed in doing it, but the idea is to bring myself to a level where I'm not talking down to folks, but nevertheless, I'm still trying to educate in an area that people many times think they know what they know, but maybe I can present, a different version, a different interpretation, and maybe force people to think.
Yeah, that's hard these days, to force people to think, but we need more people to think. And what I believe, as I watched you for so many years, is your humility and your humble attitude, both on the air, but you really bring up this word education so much. And I was watching a clip of a different podcast you're on, I believe, talking about your aunt, who is a very educated person, specifically in the geopolitical world. How does education go into the sports world? Do we need more of it? Student athletes, maybe define student athletes, what it was in your time as an English and broadcasting major, and now with NIL and transfer, what student athletes maybe is morphing into today.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because that is a constant battle, and even a refrain that it has to be education focused. When you're talking about college athletes, essentially college sports should be a vehicle where you utilize that experience, utilize that participation to develop oneself in many opportunities to develop certain skills. But leadership is really the most important job of an institution. And I think sports kind of narrows that focus in leadership development. Teaches so many different things. I mean, you develop confidence, self-esteem, certainly a level of humility, but the perseverance and the work ethic and the respect for others. These are all things that you learn being either part of a sport, primarily a team sport, but certainly in individual sports as well. And you take those skills and those virtues and you're able to apply them in real life. Not everybody's going to be a professional. Matter of fact, obviously, we know that the odds are against everyone being a professional, but everyone can gain and benefit from that experience in college. And with the things that are going on today, I think the emphasis has shifted away from those principles and those virtues towards, the real, primarily pecuniary focus, and I think it's really distracted young people.
I mean, the fact that a star in college is making more money than now sometimes the 12th guy on the NBA bench seems a little backwards in in my mind.
Well, I mean, the thing about it is that the good aspect of it is that, the right for one to, exploit and capitalize on their right of publicity is a right that should never been abrogated by the NCAA. We're all
Right.
entitled to that right of publicity. And so from that standpoint, I don't really have a problem. It's
Mhm.
how it's being used right now. And unfortunately, the concept of pay for play, disguised as name, image, and likeness is really what we're witnessing today. And young people aren't lost in developing their methods on how to gain the most out of the system, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, as I said, the values have shifted where it's more about the money than it is about the education and the opportunity that going to an institution of higher learning presents.
It's interesting about the transfer portal. I'm really fascinated about that because I remember, growing up in Syracuse, watching guys come in for Coach Boeheim and having to sit out that year in plain clothes because they were dedicated to what they were about to do. Ryan Blackwell comes to mind and a lot of guys like that. But now you have somebody finishing their college career with 4 schools just because they're sort of working up the ladder. Is there a loss of loyalty either to an institution or the educational institution, or is that also perhaps a right that, you know what, I got what I needed out of this school, now I'm going to go to that school for what I need from there to help myself?
Well, I think the environment certainly has changed from, say, when I went to school, or even when you went to school, where coaches, staff, pretty much remained at schools for long periods of time, and rarely did they go to other programs unless they were dismissed and wound up having to get a new job. They certainly weren't poached by other institutions as frequently as they are today. And so taking that into consideration, I think, from a fairness standpoint, people feel that, okay, if coaches can do that, why couldn't student athletes, if they haven't found the right fit, if they haven't found an institution that essentially can fulfill their goals, why not be able to go to another place? The problem is not necessarily a lack of loyalty, but it's also an interference with their pursuit of an education. You go from one school to another, and oftentimes credits don't transfer
Right.
correctly,
Right.
and you wind up going to a school that may not necessarily fit your academic goals, if in fact you have academic goals. And again, the focus is more about playing time and more about being able to ascend to stardom in a particular program than it is about an academic fit. And that's sad because, again, we're still talking about college schools.
Right. And so there's the academics that happen, let's say, on the court. There's also the academics that happen, of course, off the court. But a lot of academics and life lessons happen in our own neighborhood where we grew up. And you've spoken a lot about the neighborhood where you grew up. I'm just going to play a short clip that you spoke about the integration that you had and what that meant for you growing up in terms of knowing the other as well.
Neighborhood, you're Black, you're Jewish, or sprinkled in folks from Italian descent. And all we did was play baseball. I went to an elementary school that was highly thought of. I was one of the few Black kids that was in the school.
And so how did that experience, right, where right now in 2023, where we think we should know the other more than ever with social media, with so many different experiences, In fact, it seems like it's the exact opposite where we're separating. How did that experience growing up in Brooklyn, going to the same high school where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar went just a couple of years apart, um, lead you to understand that knowing the other was a really important part of the educational experience?
Well, it certainly was an exposure to different cultures, different ways of thought. And an interesting part about it is today, with more and more, I guess, integration, if you will, of cultures, we focus more on the differences than the similarities. Back
Right.
in the day when I was growing up, we looked at the common ground. Our love for sports. Parents were focused on the need for our kids to be educated, and quite honestly, as friends, we regardless of what our particular cultural background was, we focused on things that meant something important to all of us. And then today, it's just the opposite. Instead of
Hmm.
common ground, unfortunately, we look too much to the differences that ultimately wind up dividing us or used to divide us. And then we have outside forces that are injected. I mean, during those days, I grew up, the civil rights movement was all around us.
Right.
And I'm sure there were differences there, but within our communities, again, the focus was on doing the very best you can. This was post-war. People were striving to, go from working class to middle class. There are a lot of just working class people living in public housing. As I said, it was highly diverse, and all we could think about, all our parents thought about, obviously, was working and making a living so that we would have a life better than theirs. And all we
Hmm.
thought about was trying to fulfill our parents' dreams, as well as trying to find ways that we could all get along, and it worked. In fact, I tell people all the time, watching movies and listening to television, and watching television, listening to the radio, etc. I never really could see color per se.
Mm.
Culturally, we knew that, and as I said, the civil rights movement reminded me of differences. But I just saw what people were and what I could be, and focused on that, and not focused on whether or not I was going to be suppressed or not allowed to do what I could do. I never really thought that I could be prevented from achieving anything that I wanted to achieve.
And so on your journey to Maryland, was the civil rights, as you just said, not seeing color, was that part of that journey? Did it affect where you look to play? You're one of the best players in the ACC of all time. How did that go in conjunction with that? Or were they two separate journeys that said, I'm on this basketball journey, I'm interested in civil rights and making the society a little better? Or was there times when it wasn't such a friendly place for you?
I recognized differences. As I got into high school, and again, the civil rights movement, and even the war in Vietnam protests were reaching an apex. And as president of the student council, I wanted to try to bring us all together. Again, Power Memorial at that time was a diverse school made up of young people from all different parts of the city. It was obviously a predominantly white school, Catholic, and I was not Catholic. But we came from different backgrounds: African American, Irish, Italian, and Latino, Hispanic Americans all together, and we tried to find ways again to get along, as opposed to find ways where we could establish our differences. Well, we celebrated our differences. We certainly, didn't use them as wedges. And so when I was looking at the university opportunities, I wanted to go to a school where I still had that same diversity. That's what I grew up with. Even though when we moved from the projects in Brooklyn, we were very diverse, and moved to a predominantly Black neighborhood in Queens, where people were strivers. Everybody worked for a government, whether it's the post office, the police department, the fire department, or the sanitation department. Most of the people were city or federal and state workers. But going back to the idea of looking for a university and looking for that diversity, I was watching the ACC on television because they had the game of the week there, because so many New Yorkers were playing in the South, particularly in South Carolina, with Frank McGuire in North Carolina. And I was recruited by Carolina, by Duke, and some other places. Didn't necessarily want to visit there because at the time, you heard the stories and you're frightened by stories of violence against people of color. But nevertheless, I was engaged by Hubie Brown, of all people, who was an assistant at Duke, to go down and visit. And I finally went to visit Duke and recognized there are a lot of Northeasterners on campus, and really a great institution. But my worry was, what happens when I step off campus into Durham, North Carolina in 1969? And having had an experience of living in a diverse environment, what would be the result of my seeking that diversity off campus? Visited schools in the Northeast. I refused to go to visit UCLA. There's no way in the world I was going there, because I followed them once. I wasn't going to follow them again.
I'll let them know tonight. I'll be a Paulie tonight against Washington.
Yeah, and well, in the end, though, it came down to a school like Maryland, which was in the ACC. And as I said, I really admired ACC basketball. Northernmost school in the ACC, between two urban areas, Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And within proximity of New York City, where I can get home. And found an awful lot of Northeasterners, people with whom I would become accustomed to living with on campus, and ultimately made the decision to go there.
And so you've said basketball got in the way of your journey. And by that, you mean to Harvard Law School. And therefore, when you went to Harvard Law School after a 10-year MBA, like most people after a 10-year career say, I'm done, right? Go into broadcasting, do your thing. But why do you say, you know what, I'm going back to the classroom, and not exactly any classroom, but the Harvard Law School? Why? And what did you have to prove, I guess, to yourself or to others about doing that on your journey?
Well, I mean, I had always wanted to be a lawyer. As I mentioned, growing up, watched a lot of TV, and my favorite shows were Perry Mason, The Defenders, other shows people may not be able to remember or relate to. And the idea was, I wanted to be, during that period of time of civil rights struggle and others, I wanted to be kind of a voice for the voiceless, who give power to the powerless, if you will. But as I said, basketball was something that, I ultimately became pretty good at, and got an opportunity to play professional basketball. Well, a big reason why, by comparison to today, that I did pursue a career in the law is because they didn't pay us like they pay these guys today. And I thought, while I made a good living and probably could have, maybe succeeded without going through the rigor of law school and practicing law, nevertheless, it was still something that burned inside. It was the internal challenge. It was the refusal, essentially, to, not achieve what I've dreamed about achieving, and then also aspire to be something exemplary in some way, shape, or form. When I was in high school, my biggest inspiration was after I read about Paul Robeson. And Paul Robeson obviously was All-American. He's the son of an enslaved, a formerly enslaved preacher. And, he ultimately became Phi Beta Kappa valedictorian at Rutgers, also All-American in football, lettered it 11 times, and ultimately became a pro in baseball, football, and ultimately an actor and a concert singer. So as a Renaissance man, I really admired the fact that he could do all those things. And I said, why not me?
Wow.
So that's one of the reasons why, not only did I pursue law and then practice as a prosecutor and then private practice, but also sought some other opportunities that were presented to me, including in housing.
And one of those opportunities was becoming a basketball agent. And with my faith yarmulke on my head, you spoke about the ethics that sometimes were a little, or not up to standards in terms of how you live your life as an exemplary. At what point do you realize, you know what, this might put a couple more dollars in my wallet, but it's not good for my heart and soul in terms of going down the path that's not spiritually healthy?
Well, I mean, look, the problems that I saw obviously was the corruption more than anything else, and how, as an agent, in order to compete out there in soliciting clients and soliciting them for the right things. I used to tell my clients that if I've been where you are about to go, I am trained to be able to negotiate, and I certainly understand the business of sports. But I want to empower you to be able to take control of your life. And by the time we're done, you won't need, after a few years, you won't need, my tutelage anymore. And that's kind of what I promised our guys. And we had some success, but ultimately when the money became bigger in pro sports, the desperation of other agents really started to started to increase. And so now paying young men while they're still in college to become their clients, bribing other people, family members, just doing a lot of unethical things, forced me to think, well, I have two choices. I could stoop to conquer and do what they're doing, or it's time to get out of this business because I developed a good reputation. I have a license to practice law, and I didn't want to put any of that in jeopardy by participating. So after 5 years, unfortunately, 5 years, 7 first-round draft picks,
Wow.
and most of the guys, maybe all except one, most of the guys that are represented are still successful people today, are professionals, are entrepreneurs, and truly learn, how to navigate life. And I'm, proud to say maybe I played some small part in it. But after 5 years, with all of that, the confluence of all of that, I just decided that we couldn't do it anymore.
So for 30 years, you've been courtside to some pretty amazing games. And one of those unbelievable games is Duke, Kentucky with The Shot. You've had a seat to history, but you sometimes don't know that history is about to be made. And so let's just hear this for the audience to see. And just want to ask, what were you thinking before, right? Is a miracle going to happen? And what are you thinking as it's playing out?
2.1 seconds left. No team has repeated as NCAA champions since UCLA did it in 1973.
One of the things I've seen Duke do in the past in situations like this is try for the quick pass to half court and call a quick timeout so they can get in better shooting range.
There's the pass to Leitner. Puts it up. Yes!
So they didn't exactly call a timeout and get into shooting range. They took the shot. You said off the air, you're a color analyst, so you just sort of go for the ride, but you were there on the ride. What was that moment like before preparing the world to watch, and then the moment after when that's the thing that you see every March?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that, me guessing after seeing Duke play and then broadcasting some of their games, me guessing that they were going to call timeout. Probably should have known better since Leitner was perfect in that game, and they probably figured he would take the shot instead of calling timeout once again. But I think that leading up to that moment, one of the things that I recognized from a historical standpoint was, you have Jamal Mashburn on the floor, you have Grant Hill on the floor, and then of course Christian Laettner, and these guys actually transcended their positions. That they were able to play inside, able to play outside, do a lot of things that heretofore traditionally, kind of weren't the same position, if you will. They stretched the position to become different types of players and being a prototype of the future player. And that's one of the things that I mentioned, that in this game, we're seeing that occur, that the game of basketball is changing because of the way these guys played. Now, with regard to the history of that game, I was fortunate to play in a game that prior to that was considered one of the greatest college games ever. Our game, Maryland versus NC State, the ACC tournament in '74. We lost in overtime, 103-100, but Billy Packer, the late Billy Packer, and others thought that was one of the greatest games ever. We had 7 pro picks on the floor at one particular time. It was a game that had very few, if any, unforced errors, and was played at a very high level. And this game, though, with the suddenness of the ending, I think kind of surpassed it for a lot of people. But, historically, I didn't really think that it would make a great deal of history, at least not reach the legendary proportion that it did today, until, I'm back on the train going home and saying, you know what? That was something else. And by the way, that was on my 40th birthday.
Oh, nice. Happy birthday. You mentioned Billy Packer. The late Billy Packer just passed away this week. It's a timely conversation. I saw one of your tweets really saying that he was an influence of you going into broadcasting. What did he mean to the broadcasting world, and what are we going to miss about Billy Packer?
Well, Billy, I mean, he's been out of announcing for a while, but he certainly set the tone for being, one, a straight shooter, didn't mince words, but, he developed a passion for the game that was infectious. The reason I say he had an influence on my career is because it's specific. When Raycom, we did the ACC games, which Billy was like the lead analyst, was looking to essentially integrate their announcing team to find a black analyst. It was Billy who brought my name up, and I know that because the executive producer, who's still a friend of mine, mentioned that to me. That Billy immediately said, "Why don't you call Len Elmore?" And I was in my second year of law school at the time. I'd never really had any broadcast experience. But it was Billy who brought my name up, and we always had a good relationship. We did our games at the University of Maryland, so that gave me an inkling as to, he thought pretty highly of me, and I always watched him and tried to emulate his style. Again, not talking down to people, trying to educate, projecting what could happen, but telling the viewer why and how. And the thing I liked about Billy was he wasn't loquacious. He said what he needed to say, and that was it. And I think that's what viewers are entitled to.
It's a good rabbinic lesson for young rabbis coming out of school in the pulpit as well. As my senior rabbi says, if you can't say it in 250 words or less, you're probably not worth saying at all.
Makes sense. Conciseness makes all the difference in the world.
And so let's get to this idea of activism, because there weren't really classes in athletes and activism until it seems like fairly recently. Growing up again in the Syracuse basketball world, I saw their acts of kindness that they did, whether it's the special needs community, the homeless, the inner city. They were out in the schools, but not necessarily taught structurally what athletes and activism means. You mentioned often the Colin Kaepernick sort of moment in terms of athletes really using their platform and their teams and their leagues to make changes within this society. So maybe you can define what athletes and activism means to you and what you're teaching to sports management people going into the field today.
Well, when we talk about activism, I'm really talking about activism within kind of the constraints of developing social justice, or promoting and being an advocate for social justice, as opposed to community service, which has to be differentiated. Community service is providing service for a particular goal at the time, but not the broader sense of justice, which includes equity, inclusion, and certainly from a criminal justice standpoint, reform. And I think athletes have a unique platform in America because sports is tightly woven in our social fabric. And what athletes can do is bring awareness to the ills of society from a social standpoint, that they certainly can not only educate themselves and to be advocates for, but also in many ways the thing that characterizes athlete activism is their willingness to sacrifice. And we've seen that in our history. Remember, against the social, economic, and political backdrop of America, athlete activism is not a new thing. I mean, it occurred since sports became a thing in the post-Civil War America. And we've seen it in two different ways: passively through accomplishment and overcoming and essentially establishing an example. I look at guys like Joe Louis and maybe even Jesse Owens to a certain extent, who didn't speak out, but were passive in doing so because of the things they accomplished and some of the things they did behind the scenes. And then actively, you have people who definitely spoke out and demonstrated. I mentioned Paul Robeson, who was a human rights activist after his career. You look at people like Billie Jean King, Jackie Robinson, of course, was one of the original outspoken activists, both through his example and through his works. And then followed by Ali and Smith and Carlos. And today we have the Williams sisters. We got Maya Moore, who is a tremendous example. And then for mental health, Naomi Osaka. So we have different people for different reasons that are activists for different causes, but nevertheless, many of them have made sacrifices in order to get the message across.
Yeah, Maya Moore's story is amazing. I saw that on Outside the Lines, how she's gave up her basketball career, meets this
Exactly.
young man in prison, but then is doing great work. And it's interesting about the gender piece as well. I just saw Breonna Stewart signing with the New York Liberty, but really focusing on charter travel, why the men have it and why the women don't. Or in the NCAA 2 years ago, why they got this weight room that was the size of a podcast studio and the men get every gym they want. Is there a moment where these athletes have to decide? You talked about sacrifice. Will this sacrifice, if you wish, ruin my athletic career because I will be canceled in today's world? And how do they decide, or how do you think, what is those moments of decision that say, I'm going to go forward and I can do both, or I'm going to have to choose one and either speak up or not?
I don't think you can move forward and say, I can do both. You can move forward and saying, I'm going to do what's right. And then circumstance and even society will determine whether you can do both. I mean, you look at Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick didn't decide whether he can do both or not. He stood on principle, and ultimately, his livelihood was taken away from him. Although, and obviously from a karma standpoint, he ultimately gets rewarded through his corporate association with Nike, who supported him. You have others who may have been able to do both. Megan Rapinoe is somebody who's not only stood firmly for a certain principle and still has been rewarded with winning and helping women, particularly in the women's national soccer team, get equal pay. Things of that nature. It really depends on the circumstance. But the idea is that's the crossroads. You don't know. And what's more important, standing up for what's right and being an advocate, or trying to hold on to what you have and still be an advocate? Oftentimes when people do that, it becomes performative social justice activism as opposed to true social justice activism. Tommy Smith and John Carlos didn't think about, what their, what the consequences would be from them doing their demonstration in '68. Muhammad Ali absolutely knew that he thought he could be prosecuted and put in jail when he established and confirmed his conscientious objector status against the war in Vietnam. And for 5 years, he sacrificed, lost the best years of his life and the money that he could have made as a world champion, but, stood for principle and ultimately was rewarded by history. So, once you get to that point, you have to decide that social justice and your activism is more important than trying to hold on to your livelihood. Circumstances but you'll go down in history as an activist who did the right thing.
Actually interesting, because sometimes activism comes from mistakes. And one of those people that I just had on this show yesterday, now a friend of Sinai Temple, is Myers Leonard, former NBA player trying to get back into the NBA, who very quickly admitted his mistake and reached out to the community that he hurt. He was right here yesterday at Sinai Temple. He went into our 3rd and 4th graders as he watched them learn their prayers. And he said to me, I don't think you understand, Rabbi, but they are healing me. And so activism coming from the mistakes that we make. What have you seen in that, and how has that led to maybe blessings out of mistakes?
Well, I mean, I haven't seen an example like Myers Leonard, but out of mistakes, people look for forgiveness, and seeking forgiveness. That unto itself is a teaching lesson for those who ultimately, may either make the same mistake or are prone to making the same mistake, and it's a teaching lesson, and I think that's the thing that is more revealing than anything else, and people to learn from the mistakes of others. And in that regard, the mistakes that you made, especially if you're seeking forgiveness, will not have been made in vain. I mean, that is how we learn.
Absolutely. And so this is what you said. I heard you say before that you've reached an age where you still have something to give. Again, you don't have to do what you're doing, but you're doing it because you still have something to give. This is what you said about athletes and activism, what you're doing at Columbia University.
As a young man, I recognize the importance of staying true to your discipline, to be an activist for social justice, to stand for what was right. After I read the autobiography of Malcolm X and saw his transformational change, and as a young Black man during that time, that was kind of a rite of passage to read that book and understand who you are and the role that you play.
So often students today, they're young, they're in graduate school, and they don't even know the names that we're talking about. And I'm a little older than the Gen Z population. Um, how do you introduce them to those historical figures when the historical figures, I say that in quotes, are Instagram celebrities today who are using their platform in a sometimes deep way, but often maybe a little more shallow, but getting a lot more reach than the people that you just mentioned?
Well, I mean, thank goodness for things like YouTube and other other media that is captured, folks historically, and I try to use the same methods to take through recordings to kind of give people an idea of exactly who it is we're talking about, and to allow them to make the comparisons. You talk about learning from them. I talk about learning from mistakes of others, and the autobiography of Malcolm X is exactly what that tells you about the mistakes of others. He learned, through his bouts with the criminal justice system. I think that gave him an opportunity to reinvent himself, and people can recognize that there are methods of forgiveness out there in making mistakes, and others can look at the mistakes made by others and avoid them. And that's what we try to teach. And so today, as I said, comparison of those figures, historical figures of the past that have kind of set the tone for, activists today. We try to bring them alive, and then have people compare, the origins as well as what we're seeing today, and then make some decisions and make some value judgments.
So if you're our professor today and we're in your class right now, what are the 3 top books that we need to read to get into the world of athletes and activism?
Well, I don't have a textbook per se on activism. I talk about understanding individuals, and understanding history. As I said, let's take a look from the beginning of sport, when it became a thing in America post-Civil War, until today. Take a look at not only who the athletes were, what sport was about, but what was going on in the nation.
Right.
There was a period of time where virulent racism occurred, where athletes in the beginning of sport, whether it was horse racing, whether it was cycling, or even baseball, suddenly athletes of color, Black athletes particularly, were legislated out, simply because, again, Plessy versus Ferguson allowed them to be legislated out. And then you look at history, where necessity was the mother of invention, the invention of the Negro Leagues and others, which ultimately spawned, great players who were the initial Black players in the major leagues in the 40s. Why did that happen? And then again, the economic backdrop during scarce economic times, when we went through recessions and even the Depression, the people hit the hardest were people of color. And so again, athletes were, the examples, whether it was Jesse Owens, as I mentioned, or Joe Louis. They were examples for people to continue to strive, even though they were, hit the hardest. And then we have other people that people don't even know about, per se. John McClendon, who was a great basketball coach, who taught lessons in teaching in the South that were invaluable for people to hold on to, young people to hold on to as they grew and they developed. And that's just one example of so many others. So, from that standpoint, I think it's history, not necessarily any textbook per se,
Nice.
but it's history that we need to be able to chronicle and put in perspective based upon all those things, as I mentioned, social, political, and economics in America. to ultimately find out the role that athletes could play, not only in advancing civil rights and advancing human rights, but also in advancing American ideals. Again, Jesse Owens and Joe Louis are perfect examples of a cynical America who would segregate them and suppress them in America, but use them internationally against Hitler and Aryan nations, to use them as an example of American dominance and democracy, when they would beat athletes from Germany and use that as a propaganda tool. That kind of cynicism is something that we look at and recognize the propaganda opportunities that were made on the backs of these Black athletes who didn't have rights when they were at home, but certainly were used as as American ideals across the pond, so to speak.
That idea is actually brought up in the movie Glickman, about Marty Glickman, the great
Yes.
broadcaster. And it's fascinating when they said, okay, they have rights over there, but when they come home, it's like they're nothing. And then I know
I was going to say that it was sad too that Marty Glickman wasn't able to run in Germany, because he was a great athlete unto himself.
And I know one of the things you're working on within the activism world is getting not just athletes, but coaches and other people within the athletic management, specifically in the minority field, the right opportunities as well. What are the keys to that? I know the Miami Dolphins thing was definitely on your mind, and you worked hard on that. A good friend of this show, Dave Sims, also talks about how in the baseball world, he's one of the only African American announcers on TV. What are the keys to making that next step? As you just told your story, right? That Billy Packer said, talk to this guy. He knows what he's doing. Is it just that, or is it a different systemic thing that can lead to greater success?
I think it's a combination of everything. It's about preparation. That those who aspire, those of color who aspire to those positions, certainly have to be prepared, and many of them are. Then it's a question of the decision makers have to become familiar with them. I mean, I'm not going to attribute total racism to the lack of opportunity for Black coaches and Black announcers and others. I think some of it also is based upon cultural segregation, and that people just don't know. People hire who they know,
Right.
And I think it's really important for more outreach, voluntary outreach, from the decision makers to those from the underrepresented groups, to understand who they are, to get to know who these people are. So they're on the tip of their tongues as much as their white counterparts, and I think that that's extremely important. There have been programs that certainly have started to address that. I think it just needs to be more prioritized, and ultimately a point needs to be made that if in fact you get to know people, you're going to find that people have the same, if not greater, qualifications, particularly to run a team. Interesting point about it: college football, we talk about the dearth of Black college head coaches, and we've asked as co-chair of the Knight Commission, we've asked the college football playoff that controls the monies with regard to college football to donate 1 penny of their revenue source to programs such as the one I just identified. And for some reason, they just refuse to do it, which that is something that I really can't explain. And these are people who are educated and understand the issue exists, but will not get involved. And, that's a constant battle that we've had with regard to trying to create more equity in college sports.
Well, it's interesting you say where it starts, because you said people know people hire who they know, and then I go back to your story of the neighborhood that you grew up in. Who did you know in that neighborhood? People not like you and people not like me, and I'm very grateful within the Syracuse community that I grew up on the basketball court, on the baseball field, of people who were like me and not like me, and therefore I can spend my rabbinic time talking to people like you, not just about sports, but how sports is this vehicle to know the other, so that knowing the other can lead to better change as well. So it all definitely fits together. Two last questions: one ordinary, the other sacred. And I guess we'll start with the sacred. faith and sports. Do you see a role of faith in the sports world, either passively or actively? I know we see it sometimes more outwardly, specifically with Damar Hamlin went right. No prayer in the football field. Everybody pray in the football field.
Right.
But is there a role for, and I use the term faith loosely, in the world of sports that also can move on the aspects of social justice that you're speaking about?
Well, I mean, again, beyond the articulation, when you listen to athletes being interviewed, everybody wants to give God the glory, and then I'm not disputing that, but I think it's got to be greater than that, and there's also has to be recognized beyond that articulation, because some people just aren't willing to do that; they keep it private. But faith in God, or in a higher power, in a power that's generally greater than a power that's greater than ourselves. I think it gives you purpose as an athlete. It alleviates, quite honestly, it alleviates pressure too, because you're able to say, I'm moved to work as hard as I possibly can to fulfill, my to fulfill my potential. And whatever happens is God's will, not mine. And I think that's important to understand. And I think also it helps believe in an ordered society where humility is the face of humanity, so to speak, and in light of a greater power. And that, I think that's beyond mere humanity is the love and respect and ideals that we should hold and prioritize. And with that, you understand the game, you understand people, you understand teamwork and collaboration. Those ultimately become the most important thing. It always hit me. It was related to basketball, something that Dean Smith talked about. He talked about 5 players, 1 heartbeat. And
Nice.
I think that belief in others as well as reflection of a belief in a higher power and why we're here, what that purpose is. So I'm not sure if that explains, my idea of, the idea of faith in sports, if that, fully answers your question. But,
Yeah.
it's something that I've felt for a long time, that it's about purpose, and it's about understanding the order in life. And, we are, individually, we have to have that humility.
I mean, 5 players, 1 heartbeat reminds me of standing in a sanctuary of either a synagogue or a church or a mosque and singing together. And when you have that moment of singing together, you
Right.
realize that actually we are one, with many, many different voices coming together, singing that same song as well. And on the ordinary, with your expertise in the college basketball sports world, you can't keep track with who's number 1 these days because it's just falling left and right. It's February now, and we're heading to March. So, we're predictions here. It's a faith show, but we're not going to make you a prophet. But what do you see coming up in the next 8 weeks?
I see a couple more number ones. I mean, right now, I'd say Purdue is the number 1 team in the nation, but I don't know if there's the best team because there is no dominant. I think when the tournament starts, the team that is healthiest probably exhibits the most athleticism and can use defense to kind of weather the storm when the offense isn't working, is the team that's ultimately going to win those 6 games. I think Kansas has a big shot of doing that. I also like Houston, the way that they're playing. They're the kind of team that's built on that. They have guys who can step up above and beyond the call at a given time, but they do have that athleticism and that consistency on defense that can get the job done. I know a week ago everybody said Alabama was the best team in the country, and then they get slammed in the Big 12. I think it was by Oklahoma in the Big 12 SEC. So everybody's going to have their ups and downs, but in the end, I think that the character of the team that plays consistent defense, that's got athleticism up and down, and remains healthy is the team that's going to win. So I hope that answers your question, because I don't really have a team. There's no great team out there that you can say is dominant.
That was a very rabbinic answer, just asking more questions to a great question. But it's good. It's good. That's the college basketball world today. Len, we are so thankful for you joining us here on Rabbi on the Sidelines. Len Elmore, University of Maryland, 3-time All-ACC player, 1974 All-American, Harvard University trained lawyer, 10-year NBA veteran, now teaching at Columbia University School of Sport Management of Athletes and Activism. But as you heard today, really a moral voice and conscience of the sports world in this great country of the United States of America. Len, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you here in Los Angeles shortly. Have a great day.
It's been my honor. Thank you.
Thank you.